Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry for the slight late start. My Zoom client didn't want me to enter into the room, which isn't, but here I am. And you can probably tell I have a little congestion. So like my voice sounds a little nasally, but there you go. We can still study. Uh this morning we are looking at Psalm 5. And you'll probably have noticed if you're looking uh at the source sheet that Psalm 5 is significantly longer than the Psalms that we have done so far, right? And the the Psalms are variable in length. And one of the things that I am not sure about in terms of this class is how we're going to handle the longer psalms, whether they're going to take two classes or whether we'll do a little less or whatever. But I've given you a lot of translations, and I reorganized them a little so that I tried to give sort of academic translations next to each other and spiritual translations next to each other. Not that the spiritual translations are not also done with a great degree of scholarship and care. These are all like really I think they're all really well thought out translations. I didn't mean to divide them in a way that wouldn't imply that. I was just trying to see whether there might be some comparisons to be made by ones that were specifically made with a spiritual or theological purpose and ones that were made with a more scholarly attempt to do a direct translation. And I don't know whether that's fair at all, but we can try. So as usual, I'll start by reading the psalm in Hebrew, and then before we jump into the comparative translations, just if there's anything that has jumped out to you or in your reading of the psalm, something that really resonated, we'll start with that. So let me gonna share my screen so that you can follow along with me. I do think that reading the Psalms out loud in Hebrew helps to sort of get a sense for how they might have happened. And this one, of course, again has an instruction to the conductor, to the lead player. It begins with a musical notation, which we do not have the music that they were imagining. So, but you can sort of imagine this is a psalm that was probably recited in the morning. It clearly is, as opposed to some of the psalms that we looked at where it's about going to bed. This psalm is a morning psalm, and maybe the tone of the psalm, the musicality of the psalm might have shifted to a more morning expression. Morning, not MOUR, but morning, like not night. All right. Lamenetzeach al hanechilot mizmor leDavid. Amarai hazina Adonai bina hagigi. Hakshiva lekol shav'i malki velohai. Ki elecha et palel. Adonai, boker tishma koli, boker eroch lecha vatzapeh. Ki lo el chafetz resha ata lo yigorcha ra. Lo yityatzvu hololim leneged einecha, saneta kol polei aven. Te'abed dovrei chazav, ish damim umirma yitaev Adonai. V'ani berov chasdecha avo veitecha, eshtachaveh el hechal kodshecha biratecha. Adonai necheni betzidkatecha, L'man shorurai hayashar lefanai darkecha. Ki ein befihu nechona, kirbam havot, kever patuach gronam, b'shonam yachalikun. Hashimim Elohim, Yiplu mimoatzotehem, berov pishehem, hadichemo ki maru bach. V'yismechu kol chosevach leolam yiranenu v'tasech alemo, v'yaltzu b'cha ohavei shemecha. Ki ata tevarech tzadik Adonai, katzina ratzon tatrenu. So, any first thoughts, reactions? Anything that jumps out to you, or verses that you recognize? Yeah, Kathy.
I thought I recognized at the bottom of the page on the right, Ashta Ishtachava El, I think it was that one. It seemed like there was something in there that's in some prayers.
Great. Good. So one of the things that I like to do with these psalms is to think about their liturgical uses and liturgical connections. The verse 8, Vani barov chasecha avo veitacha eshachavel echal kochecha biratecha. That verse in total is a part of an anthology of verses that we say when we enter into the sanctuary. So it begins Matovu Oalecha Yaakov Mishkenotecha Yisrael. How goodly are your tents, Jacob, your dwelling places, Israel. And the second verse is this verse from Psalm 5. And then there are 3 other verses from Psalms. Let's actually look at that. If you turn to the last page of the packet, not the last page, but the second to last page, page 12. Verse 8 is contained in an anthology of verses used as a prayer for entering the synagogue. And here I've given you the translation from the Siddur that we use at our synagogue, Lev Shalem. How lovely are your dwellings, Jacob, your sanctuaries, people of Israel. As for me, through your great kindness, I enter your house. In awe of you, I bow toward your holy sanctuary. Adonai, I love your house, the place where your glory dwells. That's from Psalm 26. Then from Psalm 95, though it's adapted, the verse in Psalm 95 is in plural, but the way that it comes into the Siddur, it's changed to singular. I will bow and prostrate myself, kneel before Adonai, my creator. And then my prayers are to you, Adonai, in hope that this is a favorable time. God, in your abundant love, respond to me in faithful deliverance. So that's the all of verse 8 is contained in that anthology. So good that you recognized it. We do it is part of our Matovu prayer in the morning on entering into the sanctuary. All right, anything else that pops out at you? All right, well, let's jump into some of our translations and see what we get from it. Let's go first to page 4. And we'll look at Robert Alter's translation. Robert Alter's, I've described this translation as a scholarly Jewish approach. Rabbi Alter is a professor at UC Berkeley and recently completed his life's work of doing a complete translation of the Tanakh. It's in 3 volumes, and it's a beautiful translation of the Tanakh. I do think, and he's done a ton of scholarly work on Psalms. If he says a word means something, he's done a lot of research to decide that it means that. I will say, like, from my perspective, in terms of these translations, I do not find his translation the most like spiritually meaningful. I think it's a good translation, but I think that something in his translation lacks the sort of the poetry, the like the emotion. So I don't know. So some of them are more successful than others. I think that that's probably true of anybody who tries to translate poetry from one language to another. All right, so who would like to read the left-hand side of page 4, and it goes on to page 5?
Okay, I'll do it.
All right,
Okay,
Mark.
good. Go, Mark.
To the lead player on the Hilot, a David psalm. Hearken to my speech, O Lord, attend to my utterance. Listen well to my voice, crying out, my King and my God, for to you I pray. Lord, in the morning you hear my voice. In the morning I lay it before you and wait. For not a God desiring wickedness are you, no evil will sojourn by you. The debauched take no stand in your eyes. You hate all the wrongdoers. You destroy the pronouncers of lies. A man of blood and deceit the Lord loathes. As for me, though, your great kindness, I enter your house. I bow to your holy temple in the fear of you. Guide me, O Lord, in your righteousness. On account of my foes, make my way straight before me. For there is nothing right in their mouths, within them falsehood. An open grave their throat, their tongue smooth talking. Condemn them, O God. Let them fall by their counsels for their many sins. Cast them off, for they have rebelled against you. Let all who shelter in you rejoice. Let them sing gladly forever. Protect them, and those who love your name exalt in you. For you bless the just man, O Lord. Like a shield, you crown him with favor.
So what would you say, this is open to anyone, what would you say the theme of this psalm is? What is the emotion of the psalm? Why might you say this psalm if you weren't like David in some historical moment?
It's hard for me to imagine what kind of music this would have been set to.
Yeah, I mean, I
They
totally
could
hear
not
that.
tell who.
It's almost like David's bitching about something.
Oh, I think
Yeah, right. No question. It is a psalm of complaint. Yeah, David is right. So if we're still in that historical moment where David is running away from Avshalom, his son, right? Which is sort of at least the structure that the book of Psalms wants us to be thinking about. I don't know whether this psalm originally was written for that purpose, but definitely by placing it as the 5th psalm in this book, the compilers of the book of Psalms want us to imagine David running away from Avshalom. The previous 2 psalms, 3 and 4, were like David flees from the palace and is about to go to sleep at night and is on the run and is terrified. And this is the next morning. Now, the reality still exists. His son is still coming after him. He's still fled from his palace. But the tone has shifted a little bit, right? He is sure that God is on his side, that God does not desire wickedness, that his son is not going to be able to make it work with God, right? And he has a lot of faith, right? I'm going to go and pray in the temple. You're going to accept my prayers. All of those guys, the guys who are coming after me, they are deceitful and false, and there's nothing true in their prayers. But my prayers are joyful and grateful, right? So in its historical sort of moment, you can kind of see that waking up the next morning, David has a different sort of experience of the world. but it's still completely a psalm of complaint. Angry
Rabbi,
at the people who are against him.
it reminded me almost of a Twitter rant.
Say more about that.
Well, it just seems like that's what people use Twitter for, to complain about their enemies primarily. And it seems that David is doing that to a great degree. Some translations more than others, but in general, that was my first reaction. And I'm not a Twitter user.
What translation, can you point to a translation that really exemplifies this ranting aspect?
Offhand, no, because I only
right.
read them this morning, so I don't remember which ones are which. I'll know them when I see them.
All right. Any other thoughts about the theme of this psalm or how you might use it in your own spiritual practice? To me, right, I find this psalm harder to imagine using in some ways in my own spiritual practice, right? The bedtime psalms where you're like, okay, there's bad stuff coming around me, but I want to focus on my inner work. Like, I want to focus on my relationship to God. If only I could just talk to people normally and they would listen. Like, if only my enemies and I could just break bread together, we would be okay, right? That's the message that we had last week in Psalm 4. Like, I totally get on board with kind of using that kind of psalm in my personal practice. But right, like Mark says, this psalm, it's more sweeping. It has more of a whiny, complaining kind of like what is and yet, right? And yet this psalm has perhaps so far in our study the most used verse in our liturgy. Right? So Psalms 1 through 4, there were some connections to our liturgy, but this psalm has a verse 8, which we say every time we walk into the synagogue. That is a very well used verse. Yeah, Kathy.
I could see using it on a day that you wake up and you're facing a scary challenge, that maybe you have to meet with some people, you're not looking forward to it, and you're just hoping to be able to have strength from God to do what you want to do.
Nice. This psalm asks for strength from God. Like the last verse, right? God is shielding the righteous, or crowning the righteous with a shield of favor, right? Obviously, the language is hard to translate, but the sense is that the just person is shielded, protected by God's favor. All right, let's look at Rabbi Richard Levy's translation here. Rabbi Richard Levy, the book is called Psalms Ascending, and it's published by the CCR Press. This is a Reform Jewish approach to Psalms. Was a professor for or he taught at HUC-JAR, and even was the dean of Hebrew Union College in LA for a couple decades. And I think his translation, it's not that his translation isn't scholarly, it completely is. But he called his book a new translation with textual and spiritual commentary. His idea is he wants to write a commentary on Psalms that people could actually read and use and connect to in 21st century vernacular. So All right, so let's read that. You can find it on the left of page 6. The left of page 6. All right, Gary, did you want to read?
Sure. All right. I like the first verse. Conductor's note with buzz, a psalm of David. To my
Yeah, so
words
just
give
stop there for a sec. So, right, the
What
word
does that mean?
nifilot, no one knows what it means. Okay? In many of these translations, it just says nifilot. Like they didn't even bother to translate it. They just transliterated it. And that's true of some of the Christian and some of the Jewish translations that they just give nifilot. Now, some people translate it as flutes, and nifilot can mean flutes, right? Rabbi Levi translated it as buzz because he's relying on a commentary of the Meiri, a 13th century biblical commentator. The Meiri says that that nechilot is an instrument that sounds like the buzzing of bees. Okay, and so like I imagine like a kazoo. Okay, so when he says with buzz, he's trying to translate it in a way that captures that sense of the like kazoo or possibly flute, right? Like he's trying to give it sort of the emotions that he imagines the nichilot is cueing in for us. But yeah, it's kind of informal and exciting and with buzz. Yeah, okay, good. Keep going.
Conductor's note with buzz, a psalm of David. To my words give ear, Adonai. Hear between the lines of my mumbled meditation. Hear the notes of my cry, my majesty, my God, how I yearn for you. Adonai, it's morning, hear my voice. Morning, I'm laying it all out before you. I'm scanning the skies. A God who desires wickedness, that's not you. Chaos, wrongdoing, no longer sojourn with you. Boasters may not stand erect before your gaze. You despise doers of evil. You destroy people who tell lies, deceivers. Their hands full of blood are like idolaters in the eyes of God. As for me, embraced by your covenantal love, I am on my way into your house. I bow down in awe in this space filled with your holiness. Adonai, lead me through your righteousness because of those who lie in wait for me. Make your path lie straight before me. There is nothing proper in the mocker's mouth. Their inward parts are shattered grooves. Their throats are an open grave. Their tongue is slippery. Declare them guilty, God. Let them fall through their own counsel. With the masses of their rebellious acts, may thou banish them. How they defy you. But let all who take refuge in you rejoice. Let them shout with joy forevermore. Thou wilt give shelter to them, and they will rejoice in thee. They love your name. You grant blessing to the righteous, Adonai. With the buckler of your blessing, do you crown them? That's it, right?
Yeah, that's it. All right, so what do you think of this translation? Yeah, Mark.
It's almost like the Psalms previously were at night, and this one he woke up to a new day, and he's feisty as all get out.
Yeah, right. This really captures that kind of feistiness of this psalm. Absolutely. So what do you notice from this translation that's different from the last one that we looked at?
you can.
The interaction where he's speaking to God seems to me, I didn't get to read them in advance. It seems less formal and more personal than the other ones that we looked at.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree that this translation is trying to give David a voice that is a vernacular voice. I think if we compared this one to the same author's translation of last week's, we would find that it's a similar tone. That is, it's a similar level of formality. But it
I'm
is
laying it all out
remarkable,
before you.
right? It's remarkable in its difference from some of the other translations of this psalm that have a more formal aspect to them.
It seems like it's a much more modern vernacular, like your use of scanning, things like that I don't think of as biblical particularly.
Right. So I'm scanning the skies. That translation of the translation is of va'atzapeh, right? And the atzapeh means to wait expectantly, okay, to have expectations. But it also has the sense of like an overlook, a lookout. Like if you Mount Scopus is called Har Hatzofim because it's the mountain of views, the mountain of scoping, the mountain of looking out. Okay. And if you go to Israel and you want to turn off the highway to an overlook, it's also using this same route. And so by saying I'm scanning the skies, he's trying to translate the word that means both to wait expectantly and to look out over something. And he's trying to combine it into one phrase that captures both of those ideas. Which, like, all of that is in one word, va'atzapeh. And you'll see that some of the translations do translate it as I watch expectantly, or I wait expectantly, or in expectation. I wait in expectation. But I think, I'm scanning the skies gives you that sense of waiting. I'm laying it all out before you. I'm scanning the skies. That you still get the sense that he's waiting, but he's waiting with this kind of overview. But he did kind of invent that, like it doesn't say skies at all in the song.
Is he looking for airplanes?
Well,
Right.
I was going to say, is he looking for a signal?
He's looking for some response, right?
Yeah.
I don't think it's totally like the verse is about the majesty of the morning, and so scanning the skies is like looking at the sunrise.
Is it going to be a sunny day or a cloudy day?
Right. But I do also think, Mishka, that you're right. I think it's that he wants to see whether God, the psalmist, is asking for a sign from God, right? Show me that you're listening. Yeah.
Somehow. I wanted to say something about the tone. It seems, I won't say informal, that's not the word, but it's interesting that the very last lines he goes to thou and thee.
Good. Great. I'm glad you mentioned that. He wrote a comment about it. The Hebrew is all right, bringing the text back. All right, so the Hebrew is leolam yiranenu v'tasech alemo. The word, the Hebrew itself at the end of this psalm is an older Hebrew than the rest of the psalm.
Huh.
That is to say, what he noticed when he read the psalm is that the psalmist is using an ancient Hebrew phrase. And so his use of the these and the thous at the end is to mimic that sense of antiquity, like that even when you're reading the psalm in Hebrew, by the time you get to the end of the psalm, you're like, wow, the Hebrew itself of this psalm feels older than the beginning of the psalm. So that's what he was trying to get at.
Why do you think it is that in the original then?
Well, I don't know. I don't know, but I can say that the feel of the end feels more like some of the ancient biblical poetry, like the Song of Moses at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, the from what we call Parashat Ha'azinu, where it's right, and you can even see that he's used the word Ha'azina in verse 2, which just means to listen, but it's a fairly archaic word for listen. And the word alemo is not the usual standard word that you would use in like regular normal Hebrew. It's like the Hebrew is trying to capture a style of older poetic language. I don't know why the poet, the original psalmist, did that. But I think that I wouldn't have noticed if it hadn't been for Rabbi Levi's like use of thou wilt and thee, which he says are trying to echo his words, to echo the Hebrew archaism of the word alemo, which like mostly in Hebrew, if you wanted to say to them, you would say alehem. And alehem, you see that all the time in Torah. So why alemo here? Alemo it's kind of jarring actually once you start thinking about it. Like, why not just say alehem? Like the poet really wanted to get this kind of older sense. So he says the poet seems to use these forms for emphasis, pointing to the people who are to be praised and protected, right? So he thinks they're using it to emphasize the people who should be saved as opposed to the sinners. Other thoughts? Yeah, Gary.
What I was thinking when I was just reading this over is that I think last week one of the translations appealed to God as the God of my vindication. And reading the beginning of this, it sounds like he's saying, I'm still waiting. I'm still waiting for that vindication. I'm out here, I'm scanning the skies, where is it? But I wanted to raise another point about the part of it seeming more ancient. And it seems sort of prosaic to just say it, but if someone is compiling these and adapting them for a particular purpose, it doesn't seem hard to imagine that they would make changes, and that some parts would be more modern and some would be more ancient.
Yeah. So you're pointing to, right. I have a couple of times said, we don't know a ton about how these psalms were written, even when they were written, and we don't know very much of anything at all about who it was that compiled these particular 150 psalms into the official book of Psalms. We know that there were other psalms, right? Because they sometimes get quoted in other books, especially in the Apocrypha and in some of the New Testament books where they'll quote verses that seem to be in the same way that they quote verses from Psalms, but don't seem to exist in our book of Psalms. And so, right, so we know that like this was a compilation, and it's also clear that there were some sections of the book of Psalms that were written as units. So, you can say, oh yeah, these 5 Psalms were written together, and then they ended up as the last 5 Psalms of the book of Psalms. But they're clearly all a unit. And we even use them that way liturgically. As part of our Pesukei de Zimra, we use the last 5 Psalms of the book of Psalms in our morning service every day. So those the connection of those Psalms together seems particularly ancient, that probably even predates the book of Psalms itself. Like the compiler of the book of Psalms had some previous compilations, and they just brought them in whole stock. But you're suggesting, once there's a compiler, once we're positing that this book of Psalms wasn't written all by King David all over his lifetime, once we know that the Psalms are being brought in from different sources, the fact of having a compiler might also imply that there's an editor, and the editor might have done some sort of contemporizing of some of the verses, but left some verses less edited. I will only say this, which is, at the people who did the sacred task of compiling, I believe, did so with great reverence for what they believed was holy writ in some sense. And I believe that they did less editing than a modern compiler and editor might do, because they really believed that some of these Psalms were written with a kind of divine inspiration, or that these are poems with a particular history to them. And I think they tried as much as possible to put them in, but that's just my hunch. That's just my belief. I don't have anything that can truly back that up. So that's one aspect. The other aspect that I just would say is, I think that it's hard to argue from a complete lack of evidence. Like, you can say, oh, maybe this was edited because some of the verses seem older than the other verses, or you can say the author of the psalm was trying to emphasize something by use of archaic language. And it seems to me that in the lack of certainty about which of those it's possible, which of those we know, like going toward what can we learn from the fact that the language is archaic might be in some ways more interesting. But I guess, like, to me, maybe it's not fair. Like, I definitely think that asking the question, if you don't think about this psalm as part of David's life, but you just think about it as a poem, how might you spiritually connect to it? Like, I find that question really interesting. But the question of, is there an editor of this verse? I guess it's not fair to say that kind of question is. Anyway, I appreciate you bringing it. All right, I wanted to focus for a moment on the word chesed. Because the word chesed comes through this psalm a few times, but especially in verse 8. Va'ani berov chastecha avo veitecha. So let's go to, I have a page where I gave you a bunch of translations of verse 8. Let's see. That would be page 13. So this is the most famous verse of this psalm in Jewish liturgical understanding, because We do this verse every time we enter into the sanctuary. I've
Can you
given,
put the screen share on?
oh yeah, I forgot it wasn't. There we are.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have all of all of these translations of verse 8. But what I really want to focus on to start is the translation of the word chastecha, your chesed. Okay, you referring to God. So in the JPS translation says your love. Okay, and the word abundant here is a translation of the word rov chastecha, abundant love. Okay, so your abundant love. The Christian Standard Bible says the abundance, that's rov, of your faithful love. Chesed there is translated as faithful love. Robert Alter translated as kindness, right? As for me, through your great kindness. Again, great there is like abundance. That's the translation of the word rov. But kindness is the translation of chesed, right? Alan Ross, who's Christian, the Christian from the Kregel Exegetical Library edition of Psalms. This is a Christian scholarly approach to Psalms. Alan Ross says, your loyal love. Your loyal love. So chesed is about loyalty. So we have love, faithful love, kindness, loyal love. Rabbi Levi, whose translation we just finished reading, translated as covenantal love. Covenantal love. James Hamilton Jr. is the evangelical Bible commentator that we've looked at a couple of times in the past, and he translated as loving kindness. And Rabbi Eli Kashdan, who is the translation for the Koren Orthodox Jewish spiritual approach to Psalms, the Koren Tehillim, translated it also as loving kindness, but with a hyphen. The Walter Brueggemann is from the New Cambridge Bible Commentary. His translation says steadfast love. Rabbi Yosef Marcus is a Chabad rabbi. This is a Chabad commentary on the Psalms, Chabad translation, with Hasidic masters. Anyway, he says abundant kindness. The King James translation translates it as mercy, chesed as mercy. And there, the multitude is the translation of rov, of much or abundant. All right, and I've given you 2 sidurim as well, because I had them at home when I was working on this, and since it's in our sidur, right? Any sidur you open will have a translation of this verse of Psalms, and so Sidur Lev Shalem has kindness, and the Koren Sachs has loving kindness. So what is chesed? Kathy, yeah.
I think chesed is all of these. It's beyond love, beyond kindness. It's a great form of love that incorporates all of these. When in doubt, choose all of the above.
Great. All right. So Kathy says, chesed is all of these. It's kindness, it's love, it's loyalty. And it's something that's steadfast, something that's merciful. It's all of the above.
It's something that comes from God. And consistently with all of these, there's no conditional love.
All right.
That the psalmist feels doesn't feel like there's some kind of requirement to reciprocate. This comes from God, always unconditionally.
And maybe because it's so great, it's a type of love that can't easily be translated or described.
Great. So, Mishka points out that there's some aspect of this love that is connected to the concept of grace that we were talking about last week. That is to say, an undeserved gift. God's love is unconditional, and it doesn't have to do with your actions or your deservingness. It is abundant and overwhelming. It's coming from God without necessarily any strings attached. It is an overwhelming love that comes from as a freely given gift. God loves us loyally and steadfastly, regardless. Gary.
I didn't have that sense. I mean, the poet is very active in proclaiming his innocence and deserving. And it also made me wonder if there is some religious restrictions on being able to enter the temple in a compromised state if he were not innocent in that sense.
Nice. All right. So Mishka looks at all of these and says there's something unconditional about it. Gary says, well, maybe just in verse 8 you might get that sense, and maybe bringing it into the Siddur unconnected to the rest of the psalm gives you that sense of unconditional love. But in the context of the psalm itself, right, the poet is clearly saying there are some people that deserve God's steadfast love and some people that don't deserve it, and I am firmly in the camp of the deserving. And so it's not unconditional to anyone. It's just unconditional to me and to other righteous people. And Gary also points out that certain behaviors, certain actions, certain spiritual states might make you unable to enter into the holy temple, the Heichal Kodesh, God's sacred holy house, right? And if that is the case, then my ability to enter also shows my worthiness to receive your love, right? These go together. So I did want to point out that Rabbi Levi's translation here of this as covenantal love, I think, is significantly different from some of the other ones. What is covenantal love? Or what is covenant?
It's
Well, I
part of
guess
the contract.
yeah. So there is some requirement of a belief, a desire to connect to God, as opposed to just receiving unconditionally.
Okay, so Kathy says covenant is like a contract. Mishka says, yes, if we can translate this as covenantal love, it clearly implies some obligations on both parties, not just on the part of God to be the source of love, but also some kind of obligations on the part of the other party to the covenant, namely us, or the righteous people, or the poet, or anyone who reads this psalm, or the Jewish people when they read this verse coming into the sanctuary, right? There is another party to the covenant, and certainly in Jewish tradition, we believe that the Jewish people are in a covenanted relationship with God. So, right, and the word testament is another word for covenant in some ways. So, in Hebrew, the name for what Christians might call the New Testament, and we sometimes call the Christian Bible or the Christian scriptures, right? The word for that in Hebrew is Brit Chadashah, the New Covenant, right? It might get translated as New Testament in English, but in Hebrew, the New Covenant. And so Christians also see themselves as in a covenant with God, or in a covenant through Christ with God, or in a covenant through the Christian church, with God. And so, right, Judaism believes very strongly in its unique covenantal relationship with God, and Christianity universalism that. Anybody can be in a covenanted relationship with God as long as you do it through Christ, through the church. There's a universalism inherent in that covenant, a new covenant. And that phrase, new covenant, of course, reminds us of the Haftarah, the passage from the book of, I want to say, Jeremiah, where Jeremiah asks for God to cut a new covenant with the people. Give us a new heart, plant within us a new heart, right? I believe we read verses to that effect on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I'd have to look it up. But that passage from Jeremiah about giving us a new covenant is understood in Christian theology to refer to the covenant that Jesus brings. Obviously, that's not a Jewish approach, but it is an interpretation of those verses from Jeremiah. So Rabbi Levi translates chesed as covenantal love. He does so based on a book by Nelson Gluck, who wrote a study of the word chesed in German called Das Wort Chesed. I don't speak German, but that's what it was written in 1927. And that study shows, or Nelson Gluck believes, that the word chesed refers to the love God holds for those who are part of the covenant. And so embraced by covenantal love is supposed to show that sense of the being held by that relationship of love with God. Okay, we are close to our end time. Let me just, I'd like to share a couple of other liturgical uses of the psalm, just so you can see, how Jewish, how the compilers of the Jewish prayer book sometimes use verses of Psalms not in their original form, but by changing them. So we saw in the anthology that Psalm 95 verse 6, Bo nishtachaveh v'nichra'a nivracha lifnei Adonai Oseinu, gets that which is plural, gets singularized into the Matovu paragraph as va'ani eshtachaveh, I singular will bow, instead of we will all bow. Verse 2 actually has the opposite. So verse 2 is Psalm 5 verse 2, Amarai ha'azina Adonai bina hagigi, right? My words, give ear to my words, O Lord. Consider my utterances, or my mumbling meditations, right? That's in singular, But when we use it in our penitential prayers on Yom Kippur, we change the verse to be plural. Amarenu ha'azina Adonai bina hagigenu. And you might, once I say it in the plural, that might pop into your head from the Yom Kippur services. Also, the first half of verse 3, Hakshiva lakol shavi, is one phrase in the Hoshana prayers, the prayers for deliverance that we say on Sukkot. An interesting thing to do would be to find all of the references from those prayers on Sukkot, because they are wide-ranging. Some of them, of course, are just written for the prayer, but a lot of them are allusions to Psalms. The Koren Tehillim offers this meditation. So I started our class by asking, what's the theme? How might you use this psalm? And on the bottom of page 12, we have a meditation that you might say before saying this psalm. And so here's how the Koren Tehillim, which is an Orthodox Jewish approach, a spiritual approach to the Psalms, here's how they imagine you might use this psalm. Words cannot express my thoughts and emotions. My thoughts are numerous and chaotic. My emotions are frightening and overwhelming. Thus, I pray that God not only hears my words, but reads my mind. So, the Koren Tehillim imagines that you might use this psalm as a way of expressing an inability to express. Any final thoughts? Yeah, Kathy.
I just see it as a real supplication of it's all bigger than I am, God. I'm putting it there before you. I'm giving it to you and asking for your help. I wasn't familiar with this psalm. I think it's really powerful and beneficial.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next week, we will look at Psalm 6. Psalm 6 is the first psalm that the entirety of which is part of our prayer service. It's contained in the part of the service called Tachanun. And so we're going to take some time to next week to talk about what Tachanun is, because while we're also going to look at what the psalm means, what Psalm 6 means, I think that looking at it in its liturgical context will be important. And Tachanun is a section of the prayer service that, at least in this community, we don't focus on very much. And I also think that we don't focus on it very much in liberal Judaism in general. It's a part of our service that has sort of become less accessible. And so next week, we will also spend some time looking at what Tachanun is and how Psalm 6 fits into that set of prayers. All right. Thank you, everybody. See you next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody.
Yep. Good.